let's talk about how to make a simple, straightforward sword cover. So this is a long sword. I've put it out on my mat. You want to start out by measuring the widest part of your sword circumference. This foam is just a smidge under 9 inches around. Turn that around so you can see it. 9 inches. Most foam is either 9 inches or 8 inches. That's the two variations that I sell. 8 inches is more of the stick torque foam. Pipe insulation will be probably 9 inches. Any sort of either tubes, Duratubes will be 9 inches. Flat blades are usually somewhere in the middle between 8 and 9 inches. So measure the circumference. And then you want to add a little bit of wiggle room for just movement to get it on and off. If your foam is exposed like this rather than taped, it will be like trying to stuff yourself into some Spanx, trying to get the cover on if you make it too tight. So I usually add about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more. So I would just round this up to a little over 9. And then you want to add your seam allowances. I usually line my fabric up with the edge of the presser foot, which is about 3/8 of an inch. So multiply that by 2 because you're doing 2 layers. So 6/8 of an inch plus 1/4. I would go for about 10 inches. So your piece of fabric, when you cut it, is going to be 10 inches wide for this sword. You can generally add about 1 inch if you're working with the same seam allowances that I am to your circumference. And then your length, if I line this up with the bottom, it goes to about 31. I usually say add about 6 inches so that you have enough to pull down at the bottom of your tube and also to make your tip. So I would make this one probably about 37 inches long, 38 inches long, so it would be 10 by 37. And I'm going to go ahead and cut that. When I've laid out my fabric here, you are okay to leave your salvage edges on the top and the bottom because you're going to be sewing across and you won't see this at the top, and then at the bottom you'll probably be taping over this. You don't want the salvage edge to be on your seam. It will be visible and it will look ugly. Before you come over to your machine, you can do a quick fit check by taking your fabric and wrapping it around your sword and seeing whether that will fit approximately. Sometimes I will fudge a number and I will cut my fabric entirely too small for what I'm working on. So before we do this, we need to look at what kind of sewing machine you have. If you have any sort of average size sewing machine, you can do the H finish to the top. If you are working with something I was working with, which is this mini sewing machine that cannot sew through more than 4 layers of any fabric, you can do the round tip, and I will talk about that later. So as far as settings, you want your straight stitch. I usually fluctuate between like a 2 and a 3. You want them close together and tight, but not so tight that this takes forever. And then you want your width to be 0. You can pick a thread that matches your fabric. I just go with black because I do not have a green, and black kind of standardizes it. Before we get going, you want to fold your fabric in half, hot dog style, long ways. And if you're working with any sort of pattern that has a side, like if you're working with pattern fabric, you want the pattern to be the inside of your fold. We're going to sew this inside out, so all of the seams are to the wrong side of the fabric. So you got this folded over. You're going to start at one end, match up with the edge of the presser foot if you're following my directions. Normally, you want to back stitch when you start and stop something, but if you back stitch on this very corner, sometimes it will suck down into the feed dogs of your machine, and so I just skip it. This is going to be taped at the bottom of your sword, so you don't really need to worry about reinforcing it, and you might just cut it off if you make your cover a little too long. I like to err on the side of too long, so we are just going to straight stitch down this, keeping our seam allowance correct. I just want to keep the side of this presser foot lined up with this all the way down. And we're just going to sew. Stay. You want to make sure that both sides of your fabric are constantly lined up, because if you miss, if they start to overlap each other and you miss, you will have a big hole in your cover. The cleaner your cuts are, the easier this is. And so I will hold it a couple inches from the sewing machine and just adjust it as I go. Reline it back up. And stop and reline it back up. You can kind of see that these edges are starting to come mismatched. And I just roll it in my fingers to get it lined back up. Once you get to the end, we are going to go, I left the salvage edge on the bottom here, so we want to start before this would be visible. Stop with the needle down in your fabric. See, my needle's up. I can take this crank, twist it towards me. Very important that you twist it towards you. Otherwise you won't make a stitch. Leave needle down. Oh, and then we are going to turn 90 degrees. And then sew. If you are working on something that doesn't have the ability to sew through multiple layers of fabric, we would stop way back here and we would just sew an arc to give yourself a rounded tip. And this will get you some approximation of a good fit. I was working with this for the longest time and I could not sew through multiple layers of fabric. So the best way to do is just arc. And also if you're lazy and you just want to do an arc, go for it. And then you can fiddle with that to try to get a better fit. I just do very gentle arc. But put your press foot back down. Sew as straight across as you can. All the way to the end. And then you have this little reverse button. You're going to back stitch over your stitches. And then forward again just to lock it in. Now you have this straight top that you can cut some of the extra. And then we're going to take this inside out and we're going to slide it over our sword. So this is to check fit, make sure that you didn't leave any holes on the side. And then we're going to pin it for the H-top. Putting the cover on your sword shouldn't really be a struggle, especially if you have packing tape on it. It can be a little bit difficult if it's the uncovered foam. So we're going to slide on, make sure that I didn't leave any holes. And then when you set it up, it should start having these little dog ears. And that's what we're going to pin. So you just need 2 pins. We're going to lay this seam one direction. And then we're going to pin these dog ears like this on both sides. So if you pin this correctly, seams should all be laying the same direction. And you've pinned all the way through these little dog ears. And we're going to take this off the sword and we're going to sew across where the pins are. So when we stop this, we want to do a back stitch. Line up where your pin is, on your sewing machine, drop your presser foot down, sew, back stitch, sew across, back stitch, and then you're done with that side. And of course, don't sew over your pin. That's one side. Flip it over to the other. You got your dog ears. We're going to trim off all these strings and we're going to turn it right side out, and then you can put it straight on your sword. A good check of whether you pinned this correctly and sewed it correctly is the distance between these 2 points should be the diameter of your foam. It's going to fit right snug over the tip of your sword. Here is the sword with the cover on. You have a nice little H on the tip. And then when you come down here to the end of your foam, you're just going to cut the extra and then cloth tip around, and you have a sword cover. I like my sword covers a little bit tighter than this. This one's kind of a hybrid where it has 9-inch foam and then it has 8-inch foam, so it's going to have a lot of extra right here. You want to try not to have a ton of extra. If you don't like how loose it is, you can go back and do another straight stitch down the side and take a little bit more out. But right here, it's a fine fit, because that's what we measured. This was the 9-inch foam. This is the 8-inch foam. That's a little big. But there you go. That's how you make a sword cover.